Good evening. My name is Alan Wiseman. I'm the chair of the political science department at Vanderbilt University, and I'm also the co-director for the Center for Effective Lawmaking. For those of you who might not be aware, the Center for Effective Lawmaking was formed in September 2017 as a research partnership between the Frank Baden School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia and Vanderbilt University. The mission of the center is to seek to advance the generation, communication, and use of new knowledge about the effectiveness of individual lawmakers and legislative institutions in Congress. And to that end, in addition to a wide array of research activities and student engagement, one main agenda item of the center's activities is to bring to our respective campuses prominent current and past lawmakers, especially within the US Congress, to talk about their experiences and ways in which we can engage effective lawmaking practices in the contemporary US economy and political system. So with that as a brief introduction, I'm incredibly thrilled for the lineup we have planned for this evening. The first person I'd like to welcome out on the stage is that of our Chancellor, Nicholas S. Zeppos. As many of you know, Chancellor Zeppos is the 8th Chancellor of Vanderbilt and has led the university for more than a decade. He joined Vanderbilt in 1987 as an assistant professor in the law school. He is a highly respected, not only as a legal scholar and talented professor, but also as a thought leader and vigorous advocate for higher education in America's research universities. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Zeppos to the stage this evening. Also joining us this evening is Jon Meacham. Professor Meacham is the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Chair of American Presidency and Distinguished Visiting Professor. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and his newest works include The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels, and he's also recently co-written Impeachment, An American History. Please join me in welcoming Jon Meacham to the stage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good to see you, sir. They enjoy each other's company a bit. That was funny, wasn't it? So, the next two guests, before I introduce them, just as a little bit of personal backstory, it is really good, isn't it, Mr. Meacham? So our next two guests, based on a little bit of personal backstory, Jon, taking back to myself, and one of the reasons I'm particularly excited to welcome both of these individuals to the stage is 5 years ago I turned 40, and to celebrate, my wife and our daughter hopped on a plane for about 12 hours to go on vacation. I was looking for some light plane reading. A friend of mine recommended the latest Twilight novel, as well as the third edition, or the third chapter in the Hunger Games trilogy. At the last minute, a colleague of mine recommended a book written by a prominent Washington Post reporter titled An Act of Congress. Myself, being a student of politics and being a Congress junkie, I picked it up, wondering if this was really going to be light plane reading, and truthfully, after the first page, I was completely hooked. The book reads like a novel about contemporary power struggles within Congress to pass a major piece of legislation. As many of you know, that piece of legislation was the Dodd-Frank financial reforms. The book is an outstanding inside baseball account of contemporary policymaking in the US that resonates with much of what we actually teach in political science. So from a personal perspective, it made it seem like I wasn't espousing mindless lies in the classroom. As one reviewer notes, and I quote, "For those who want to see real change in Washington and how the nation can extricate itself from the awful mess, Act of Congress should be essential reading. This is a book that should be on every informed voter's reading list." With that, I am saying we're very excited to have the author of this book, Robert G. Kaiser, who served on the staff of the Washington Post for over 50 years, where he reported on the US House and US Senate. He was a correspondent in Saigon and Moscow, served as the national editor and managing editor and associate editor and senior correspondent to the Washington Post. So please give me a warm welcome to Mr. Kaiser.
Wow.
It's all true. And the final guest I'd like to invite out on stage, who was a major figure in the Book of the Act of Congress and the lead sponsor, or one of the lead sponsors of the Dodd-Frank Act, that being Congressman Barney Frank himself. As some of you know, Congressman Frank served in the U.S. House of Representatives from Massachusetts from 1981 to 2013, including serving as the chair of the House Financial Services Committee from 2007 to 2011. He was, as I said before, the leading co-sponsor of the Dodd-Frank Act. He is also the first openly gay member of Congress since 1987. He was a prominent advocate of LGBT rights since his days in the Massachusetts state legislature, and he was also the first member of Congress to enter into a same-sex marriage in 2012. He is widely recognized as an absolute master of parliamentary procedure and policy matters, and he's appreciated as a highly effective lawmaker in both academic and practitioner circles. So can you please give a warm welcome to our esteemed guest, Congressman Frank.
Congressman Frank and Bob, it's great to have you here, and thank you for allowing us to have this conversation, but also for spending the next day or more with our students and faculty. And we're always looking for insight and illumination from those outside of the academy, so it's great to have you here. John, it's good to see you.
Sir.
Yes, and why don't I always like John to start out, and then I always like to say maybe I'll get a question in.
But he's a professional.
Well, Congressman, I did some research today, and I talked to an old reporter who covered you, our friend Mike Barnacle, who told me to ask you about your early campaign slogan.
Yes, I know the one, as we said, Mike had in mind. It actually grew out of my elementary school experience, because I have been in a lifelong war with inanimate objects. I break things and drop things, and I'm left-handed, and back when I was a kid, you had to write in ink, and your left hand smeared across the paper as you did it. And so my work was rarely aesthetically pleasing. And I would object when I got all the answers right, but it didn't look too good.
Right.
And I would argue with teachers, neatness doesn't count. And when I ran for office, somebody took a picture of me. At the time, I was somewhat careless with my appearance. I work harder at it now. Partly, frankly, was when I came out and dealt with all that. But I saw a photo of someone had taken of me, sitting, actually, I was at a law school, Suffolk Law School, teach, and I looked disheveled. And the picture just, it struck me. I was tired of having to apologize for that all the time. So I made a poster of me that said re-elect. I was running for my second term then. And the slogan was, neatness isn't everything. It was going to be neatness doesn't count, but politics enters in everything. My sister Ann, who you would ask about, John, who was a very distinguished political communications expert, at the time she had 3 teenage daughters, and she says, no, if you say neatness doesn't count, every mother is going to hate you. Soften it, son. So, that was so it became neatness isn't everything. But as I told you, I was actually proud of my first year slogan when I ran, the year George McGovern ran for president, and all the students who lived in the area I was trying to represent were for the first time going to vote in Massachusetts because they wanted to vote for McGovern. And they had no idea, no interest in the job I was running for, the state legislature of Massachusetts. So I had my picture taken with McGovern and borrowed an old punchline from an old joke about a name dropper. And that poster was me and McGovern, and it said, who's that guy with Barney Frank?
And you won, and he didn't, so it worked.
No, well, he won my district. As Bob mentioned, I think I'm the only person in America who won on George McGovern's coattails. Literally.
It is like the best restaurant in a hospital. It's not a big
And
deal.
I also though feel vindicated because having been elected, one of the first things I did in that year, my first term, was to file a bill to legalize marijuana. So America has now caught up with me here
There we are.
47 years.
What was if you had an early formative legislative experience, either in Massachusetts or when you went down to Washington, that you think back on as, this is where I learned a lot of what I needed to learn? What was it?
Actually, one of the things I'm proudest of, in Massachusetts, the state Senate districts had been arranged to represent the various ethnic groups, but they were the white ethnic groups. In the city of Boston, there was an Irish seat, an Italian seat, a Jewish seat. There were some Polish seats out west, Portuguese seat in the southeast, no black seat. The black community of Boston wasn't as large as other cities because the thing that attracted African Americans out of the south to the north was never welfare. It was the chance to work in large industrial operations and make a decent living. And Boston never had that kind of, we didn't have autos or steel. They all went to the Great Lakes. But by 72, there was enough of an African American population. It was in the center of Boston. And when they did the Senate districts, was the blacks were the universal donor. They gave some to the Irish district and some to the Jewish district, but never enough so they could elect themselves. And that was the first year of 72. A significant number of blacks got elected to the state house, 5, which was never been more than 2. So a group of liberal Democrats worked with the Republicans, who at that point we had moderate Republicans in Massachusetts.
Even
I know
liberals.
people. Yes, we have Ed Brooke and Frank Sargent. Yep. And we joined with them over the objection of the Democratic leadership to create a black Senate district. We did it by the governor vetoed the redistricting. And we had a tremendous effort to keep up a coalition to uphold his veto, and I was the leader of the whites there. And so that was a lot about coalition politics and how to, and also I learned one of the things that became very important to me, which is how to differ with your leadership without blowing up any chance of being effective. I mean, years later, I drew on that when I was asked by the members, by somebody, if I was worried that Nancy Pelosi was going to be mad at me because I had opposed her choice for majority leader. It was Steny Hoyer over, she made one mistake, she made with Jack Murtha. And my answer was, at that time I was chairman of the committee responsible for trying to get things through, and I said, no, I'm not afraid of my leader, I'm afraid of my followers. But that was an effort to do something that I believe strongly in principle, to build a coalition, but also to try and minimize the damage that I would do to longer-term relationships.
Bob, the book is a must-read. It's a nuanced account of how does a bill become a law, and what are the veto gates along the way, what are the complexities, trade-offs. Does nuance work today as a journalist? When you wrote the book, are people receptive to these sorts of projects?
As something to read, you mean? I don't know.
Or be persuaded?
Yeah, it's this is a complicated subject now. One of the lessons of this book, to me, sadly, was the realization how few Barney Franks there were in the House of Representatives or the Senate. Most members, as I write here, of both houses voted on this very important, really the most important bit of financial regulation passed by Congress since the early New Deal. They voted on it without understanding anything about it. The decline in the quality intellectually of members of Congress. It's not particularly subtle or nuanced, but it's very important and very hard to write about. Journalists are reluctant to say, you know, the real problem with Congressman X, and there are a lot of X's now in Washington, is that he or she is a dope. That's a hard thought to articulate in the public prints, and it's against the rules of our profession, so we don't do it. but it's a governing fact of life now. Barney's successor, he won't say it, I'll say it, Jeb Hensarling of Texas, a Republican conservative, didn't have a clue about financial regulation. He just listened to lobbyists and his colleagues, a few who knew a little something, and he did what they wanted him to do. But he never understood the subject matter, and that was sadly typical. So this is, we could talk about your question at boring length, but I mean, we do not live in an age of nuance, do we? Yeah. And it's just very hard.
And adding dopes to it doesn't help either.
Doesn't help either.
Let me just make two
Although it
comments.
might make you president, because that's, yeah.
Well, but that's a relevant thing to what I was going to say, John. Two comments to add to it. First of all, the good news is that despite my successor's instinctive, reflexive, ideological opposition to regulation, he didn't get anywhere with it. And that, I mean, it's true. A lot of the members didn't understand this, but they did understand enough that what he wanted to do was wrong. And even in a Republican Congress, they were not able to weaken it legislatively. The other thing I would say...
Despite Trump having campaigned on how terrible it was.
It was, right. They were put...
Talking about somebody who didn't understand it.
Well, the most frustrating thing for me was that this man got himself elected in part as an opponent of the establishment and the financial elite, and in fact was very much their guy, except members of Congress, even the Republicans, no, they would never have passed that bill, but they were smart enough not to want to vote to repeal it. They knew how the public would react. But that's the second thing that leads me to the public. And I agree there were problems with the quality of members of Congress, but as Tip O'Neill always pointed out, no one serves in the House of Representatives who did not get more votes in the previous election from the American people than anybody else. You can't be appointed to the House like you can be to the Senate. And the problem is the voters, to some extent. I used to say when I was in office, I'm critical of a lot of my colleagues. Journalists increasingly came to make me crazy, but the people are no bargain either.
Quoted in the book.
So assuming that there are a lot of dopes running around, which I think history would tell us and experience that you're exactly right, is there a pre-lapsarian moment against which you're weighing this? Do you think of an era in the post-war Congress?
There was. It's interesting. Barney and I have talked about this a lot. I think we grew up in an anomalous, weird time. FDR changed the political topography of America. A lot of people were drawn into public life in the 30s and 40s and 50s as a result of that change. And we had this quite glorious period. Estes Kefauver from this state is an example of this. Really smart, complicated people who got into Washington, important positions in Washington, and did big things. And I thought for a long time that this was the norm. But then suddenly began to dawn on me, no, this was an exception. This is probably the period from 32 to 82, roughly, is the high watermark of intellectual quality in the American Congress, I think.
And let me just throw in again, go back to my theme, that you can't have elected officials who are significantly better than the voters want them to be, but that period, and we now see retroactively, that was also an important economic period. You read Thomas Piketty's book, it's what he refers to, what the French called les 30 glorieuses, the glorious 30. I'm working on a book now. My argument is that Keynes has to be somewhat revised. From the end of World War II until late 70s, early 80s, it was also a great time economically.
Sure.
America was doing well and everybody was benefiting. And the 80s becomes a political decline, but I think that is related to the fact that it's when the economy changed and when growth in the West became a source of increasing inequality. And I think, John mentioned the president, it's directly connected. Donald Trump couldn't have been elected in period where the public was generally, by and large, satisfied. So that, but the mistake is to think of that immediate post-war period in America, and maybe in much of the rest of the world, as the norm, when in fact it was the peak. And neither before it or after did it live up to it.
How much did the fluidity in ideology and party matter in that period where you had progressive Republicans from Ohio and Illinois?
Unfortunately, we didn't have them, but that's another thing that needs to be noted in terms of eras. Bipartisanship was the norm in America. Look, under the presidencies, well, in all those, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush again, and Obama, there was a great deal of cooperation. And it ended quite consciously on the part of the Republicans. Mitch McConnell said it when Barack Obama won. There were movements in the public that were moving the Republican Party to the right. In 2007 and 2008, when the financial crisis hit, the Democrats controlled Congress, George Bush was president, and there was a great deal of cooperation. And then Barack Obama became president, and it ended. And if you read the books by Ben Bernanke, the head of the Fed, appointed by Bush, Hank Paulson, his Secretary of the Treasury, Sheila Bair, his appointee to head the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, they all repudiate the Republican Party. They all know that when the crisis came, it was the Democrats who were supportive. And so Barack Obama never got from Bush what we got. And in fact, that affected the legislation. I had almost no support in the House. And there's a moment. In 2007, I'm the chairman, and we put through a bill to restrict bad loans, subprime loans, to people who couldn't repay it. And the then Republican senior member of the committee, somewhat of a populist guy from Alabama, Spencer Backus, supports us and brings with him about 35 to 40% of the Republicans. The Republicans who were becoming dominant, including Jeb Hensarling, who became chairman, complained to the Speaker that he was collaborating with us. And they threatened him with loss of that position. And from then on, we never got any cooperation from the Republicans in the House. It is true, there were 3 moderate Republicans in the Senate who helped, but that's down to 1 now. And unfortunately, by the time we got into power with Obama, that takeover, and in fact, the night got reinforced. Because in 2010, and this is another very important electoral fact, in 2010, Republicans who had cooperated with the Bush administration in the measures to deal with the financial crisis lost badly. Mike Castle in Delaware lost to a lunatic. Kay Bailey, the one I'm not a witch, was she the one who had to say she wasn't a witch? Kay Bailey Hutchinson was the senator. She was going to be the governor. Instead, Rick Perry became the governor. Bob Bennett from Utah, very respectable conservative, couldn't even get on the primary ballot. So 2010 confirmed the absolute right-wing takeover and intimidated any Republican who wanted to differ.
Take me back to the crisis, because I seem to remember a moment when the first vote fails.
Yes.
And, I'm sitting here as the new chancellor, and I'm seeing all of money disappear in the country and just everything getting locked up. And I'm thinking, well, this is great. Commercial paper market's not moving, money market's shutting
Not
down.
a good time for fundraising.
No. But I remember seeing the screen with the failed votes. What was it like, and how did you kind of whip, or what did the Bush people, and we had the president here last month talking about sitting with Bernanke and Geithner and Hank Paulson and saying, this thing's going over a cliff. What was it like when that vote failed, Congressman?
Let me start by giving George W. Bush credit. I'm not a great fan in general, but as things began to hit towards the cliff in 2008, he gave full support to Paulson and Bernanke, who were breaking with sort of the increasingly rigid Republican doctrine of don't do anything. and he stuck by them. But the part of the problem was John McCain, who played a somewhat unfortunate role in this and would not support the effort. So what happened was this: the Democrats, well, one of the Republicans were then in the minority, and I think one of the great inaccuracies about government is Lord Acton's dictum. So we call this dictum, I guess. But Lord Acton's statement: "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." In legislative bodies, it is impotence that corrupts, because when you're in power, you are held responsible, and being in the minority is a license to just say, "The hell with it, you're in charge, let the fire burn." So what happened was we thought we had a deal with the Republicans in the House. They thought they did too, where we would prevent a majority of Democrats to be for this TARP program.
This was the bailout.
This is the bailout, which did, I point out, it provided money to banks, all of which was repaid with interest, but it was still seen at that time as giving them money. And the reason was, as the Chancellor said, if we hadn't done that, there would have been, the economy was about to collapse, according to the Bush people, worldwide. But the right wing had taken over the Republicans, and McCain kind of encouraged them. So when the vote came,
I think, in fairness, he was afraid to discourage them. It wasn't an active
no,
wishing on his part.
I agree.
But he was afraid of the right wing.
yeah, that's
If you don't believe me, ask Sarah Palin.
No, that's a question, and in fact, it's true. At one point, we had a meeting, and he wouldn't say what his position was.
Right, that's
and
right.
Paulson reports in his book that he later asked McCain why he wouldn't say what he thought, and he said, to my surprise, maybe a little gratification, to be honest, there's ego involved, "Well, it's very hard to say anything when Barney Frank is yelling at you." And my husband, when he read that, said,
I think
"Hey."
that's very unfair.
Yes, well, my husband said, "You're pretty powerful. This is the guy who withstood North Vietnamese torturers, but you yell at him, and he doesn't want to say anything." But the right wing defied their own leadership, and the thing lost. Now, what do we think? My view was, frankly, I did believe it at the time, that we would win, that it would turn around. Here's the phenomenon of legislating. And again, you will notice I talk often about the people, because having been a legislator for 40 years, state and federal, I know how much my colleagues really do care about the public, even though the public doesn't believe it. And generally, the people who are opposed to something are always more active than the people who are in favor of it. So before the vote on this bill, members were hearing overwhelming, including my office, 90% don't do it, don't vote for it. And that, particularly among the Republicans, they didn't feel any obligation, they weren't in charge, they were able to vote no. What then happened was the consequences of the no vote showed up. Stock market dropped 700 points during the day when the vote came. And then all of a sudden the people who wanted the economy to survive called. So the constituent opinion switched. And I remember Jim and I were in the airport going back the day afterwards. We ran into a couple guys from North Carolina. I said, "Congressman, what's going on with this?" I said, "Well, the Republicans voted against it." I said, "Who's your congressman?" I said, "Howard Coble." I said, "Well, he voted against it." "Oh, did he?" And they got on the phone to Coble, and he voted for it the next time. So, that's what I thought was going to happen. In fact, as Paulson has acknowledged, I called him that night, or he called me, and I said, it's kind of like a teenager running away from home. Sometimes you got to pretend that you let him do it, and a couple hours later he comes back hungry and cold, and you're okay. I said, I believe they're gonna turn it around. And what happened was the public reaction was such. Plus, the Republicans in the Senate were more responsible at that time. Although, as I said, several of the Republicans in the Senate who had taken the lead in supporting this were defeated.
Right. Yeah. On the point of bipartisanship, I interviewed Paulson for my book and talked about Barney. And it was before he'd done this, which he later did in his own book in public. But he said, if it weren't for Barney, we could have lost everything. Yeah. And he gave him total credit. It was really interesting to me.
And I had to sell that to the Democrats. I mean, look, people talk about what happened with partisanship. We're talking now about 6 weeks before a presidential election, the most fraught time in American history politically. The economy is going into the toilet, and the Bush administration is in charge, and they have been in charge for a while. And the Democrats, in a majority, and we worked hard to do it, voted for something that the Bush people asked us to vote for that we knew was going to be unpopular. And I believe today the TARP program will go down in history as the most highly unpopular, wholly successful thing the government ever did. And we did make more money back. And by the way, the justification for giving money to the banks was, if the banks didn't have any money, nobody else did either. And the notion that we were bailing out the rich, I guarantee you that Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, had enough money salted away to get through the crisis. But it's the guy living paycheck to paycheck who was suddenly not going to get a paycheck that we were worried about. But it is true, the Democrats stepped in, and the majority of the Democrats were supportive. And then we were rewarded by one of the worst defeats in congressional election history in 2010. Of the committee that I chaired, and Nancy Pelosi had put a lot of people, and by the way, she was magnificent in helping us with this. About 10 of the members of the 30 whatever were defeated for re-election at a very high. I mean, having helped save the economy, it didn't help us. People were very, very angry at us. And the problem we had was this. Obviously, things were still bad, but they were much less bad than they would have been. And that's one of the things that people don't understand. One political argument you should never make is, well, things aren't getting worse as fast as they had been. If you're an economist, a decline in the rate of decline is a good thing. If you're a politician, it is not. And I had my toughest race since my first one in 2010 because of this, and I was held responsible. I'd made one stupid statement that I was subject to being used against me. I was complaining to my staff, here we saved the economy, and we're getting all this crap for it. And I did say one thing, and they actually made up one copy of the bumper sticker. They were afraid I would use it. And it said, "Re-elect Frank, things would have sucked worse without me."
What percentage of the vote did you get in 2010?
I won 54-43. But that was down from my usual 70.
Yeah.
Point there, by the way, nobody should be in legislative leadership unless he or she has 15 or 20 points to lose. Because at some point, I mean, that's one of the reasons Nancy Pelosi has been so effective. She represents a district in San Francisco where if she got 82% of the vote, they'd be having palpitations. You are called, the rank and file legislators make a deal with the leadership. We will support you for leadership if you will do what you can to shelter us from unpopular decisions. That's part of the job of the leadership is to, I would have people come to me when I was chairman and say, such and such a bill. Are you going to bring that up because the chairman had control of the agenda? I said, oh no, that'd be very irresponsible. I would say, good. You're sure not going to bring it up? Yeah, okay, then I'll tell people I support it.
How often in your years did you have a conversation with a colleague who put a policy choice ahead of ongoing personal political survival?
Very often in that year, and it's a very good question, Young. I want to make one distinction. The reason for not doing the right policy was always voters. It was not contributors. I know, maybe they just didn't want to say it, but no one ever said to me, just I got a lot of contributors, it's going to hurt me. Part of the thing is that the contributors and the voters overlap. But the most effective lobbyists during that were the constituency groups which are widely placed throughout the country. The small banks had more than the big banks. The realtors. Yeah. The one issue I lost on was the automobile dealers.
Yeah.
They got themselves exempted from the Consumer Bureau because everybody's got Happy Fred or Cheerful Joe, and they're on television waving and looking silly, and they go to the Rotary, and they sponsor Little Leagues, and everybody had one in their district. Bank of America, most people had nothing. But during that year, people, and they did lose over it, some of them, but that's unusual. But in that case, basically, That's why I said it's not true that power corrupts. I'll give you an analogy of this. The more important the issue, the more likely people are to vote against their political interests. From the time I got to Congress in '81, I was an advocate for gay rights. I was still in the closet until '87, but I made a decision when I first ran for office that I wasn't going to be able to come out, I thought. But it would be dishonorable not to support gay rights. And in fact, I formulated a principle at that time, which I think defines an honest politician. Nobody can obey every law. We just have too many of them. But I do believe if you are in politics, you are morally obligated to obey every law you voted for. And so I was pushing for gay rights. And when I was lobbying for gay rights in the early '80s, members would say to me, Democrats, liberals, oh, pal, look, I didn't know I was gay, but they'd say, pal, of course you're right. I got nothing against those people. But it'd be political death, and who cares? It's not a big deal. The anti-gay discrimination wasn't seen as a big deal, partly because those of us who were gay and lesbian were hiding the fact that we were gay and lesbian, so we couldn't document the pain we were suffering. And then came AIDS. And the votes then were on whether or not to do research and medical treatment and aid for people with AIDS. And so lives were now at stake. So it was impossible for people to say, oh, I don't want to vote for that because it's not important. And what I would get would be, frankly, I would say, you got to vote against this amendment. It'll mean that the hospitals can't do the stuff about AIDS, et cetera. And the reaction I would get, to be honest, was, oh, shit, I got to vote for it, don't I? Because the stakes were so high. And that's what we saw again during the financial crisis. So to an unusual extent in those cases, as the stakes were so high, members said, I got to do this. Not everybody, obviously. And that was one of those times.
Let me add something, though, about your good question. We've had a big change in America in the last 20 years, beautifully articulated to me from my previous book, which was about lobbying and money, called So Damn Much Money. Lee Hamilton, great congressman from Indiana, still alive, said to me, summing up this change, he said, when I came to Washington, I cared about policy. I wanted to work on issues. I wanted to pass legislation. And most of my colleagues seemed to be on the same wavelength. That would have been early 60s, I guess, for me. He said, today, meaning late 90s, policy is much less important. What matters today is politics. Newt Gingrich, in my personal opinion, read more than once, the leading villain of our time in despoiling our politics. Newt Gingrich convinced everybody that all that mattered was winning, everybody on his side. He's the one who told all members of the Republican caucus in the House, you cannot move to Washington. You must live at home and commute every week back and forth. Because we'll run a campaign against any Democrat who lives in Washington that they've become prisoners of Washington, Washington personalities. And it worked. And the result was that the Washington I grew up in the late 40s and 50s, a Washington where members of the House and Senate came to school sports games and rooted for their kids playing in the games, Republicans and Democrats on the same team in the stands and on the field. That's gone. Members don't know each other. They literally have no personal relationships across the aisle.
Let me reinforce that. The only time members get to interact these days is in conflict. There was no socialization. I was unusual. I stayed in Washington weekends, and there was almost nobody there. But I want to merge the two things that we're saying, because that is the case. And when I say, though, in important cases, members would do the right thing, in general, and Bob's right about the level of information, but what happens is most members, most of the time, are willing to defer to those people who are experts, especially in your own party.
It was fun to watch Barney huddling with members of the Democratic caucus in 2010 in the fall. They'd come to Barney, I saw it more than once. What do I say about the bailout? What do I say about Dodd-Frank? And they listened to him. It was interesting.
No, the more important the issue is, the more they will, the deference will be there. The other thing is this about members, and it's one of the secrets the press doesn't reveal enough. I was chairman of the committee. I had 71 members of the committee in the year we passed the bill. 42 Democrats, 29 Republicans, representing the ratio in the House. And so I used to go to bed at night literally counting ayes, A-Y-E. I would need 36 out of 71 to pass any particular issue. And I would literally go to bed every counting, until I got to 36. And what would happen would be this: when I got to 36, I had several members, on any given issue, that'd be tough. I could say to some of the members, they're not totally honest, but I was trying to get the bill through, I don't need you. And that's the music to another member's ears. I don't need you.
I'll give you a pass on this one.
Yeah, but I may need you. Hold off until the end. If you watch votes, sometimes you'll see a lot of people don't vote until it's clear what the vote's going to be, and then a lot of other people will come in and they'll vote for the losing side because they can do that. But there was that deference on important issues, and yeah, you would have to, but I still have to say, I'm very proud, a number of Democrats who were in marginal seats knew that this was unpopular. Although we were disappointed, I got to say, we did think that we would get credit for passing this bill. And the people were just so angry that nobody really did, except Elizabeth Warren, who wasn't in office at the time.
So we've talked a lot about legislating and your experience in the House, and we've mentioned Newt Gingrich. Is the Senate, when you look across to the other chamber, is it becoming more House-like, or should we be concerned about that part of the bicameral institution?
I covered the Senate in the last years of the 70s, and my favorite senator was from Tennessee, Howard Baker, a truly great man who, among other things, sacrificed his own political career to vote in favor of and get past the Panama Canal treaties, one of the great phony issues of our time, which, thanks to Jesse Helms and Ronald Reagan, became a litmus test for conservative Republicans. And Baker took them on and won, and knew that that was it for him in presidential politics. Baker stayed in the Senate after that, became majority leader when the Republicans got in, and then announced he was leaving, retiring. Howard, I said, why are you doing this? Oh, he said, look at my caucus. It's all these Gingrich people that have come over from the House. The Senate is never going to be the same. He really didn't like the new right-wing element in the Senate, which was increasingly important, part of the Republican caucus. Unfortunately, he never said this publicly. I used to push him before he died, but I've made it clear several times in print that this was his position, which he confided to me, certainly. It's the Bob Woodward rule. If they die, it's no longer off the record.
To reinforce that, first of all, we add with Gingrich, it wasn't just that you won. And Gingrich really was very successful in this negative stuff. He preached to the Republicans that they were never going to get out of the minority until they demonized the Democrats. And specifically, he told them, you are not disagreeing intellectually with people of goodwill on substance. You are opposing people who are corrupt, immoral. The Democrats were bad people. And that began to win, and as that began to win, Democrats obviously responded to some extent. But it's true, it took over the Senate as well, and again, I'll return to my theme. And the transmission mechanism of Republican primary voters. 2010 again confirmed that. You had Robert Bennett was a very able, distinguished conservative from Utah. His father had been the senator. He was a leader in getting the legislation through to stop the bleeding. He couldn't even get enough votes in the Utah State Convention to get on the primary ballot. K. Bailey Hutchinson, who was a very popular Republican senator, lost the gubernatorial primary to Rick Perry, who nobody had ever heard of. Similarly, Mike Castle ran for the Senate. He was a very
Member of the
liberal
House.
Republican. No, he ran for the Senate that year.
But he was a member of the House.
Right, he was a very liberal Republican House member, one of the few who supported some of what we did, and he lost to this woman who was nuts. Of course, the Democrats wound up winning the seat. But, so the Senate did get transformed. It resisted a little bit more. But the Senate has become similar. In 2008, when we voted on the TARP, the Senate was much better. But by now, by the process Bob's talked about of these Gingrich people coming over, because the largest single contingent of senators are former House members. So they come with those attitudes, but also it's the Republican primary voters. At first, that benefited the Democrats. Senator Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, would have lost, but he ran against another lunatic who won the nomination. Senator Claire McCaskill, she lost this time, but she won the time before because there was a guy in there who
Liked rape.
no, it was the other guy before who said about rape.
Rape, yeah.
Aikens, I think.
Todd Aiken.
Todd Aiken.
Election night
That's
212.
right, yeah.
Election night 2012, it was hard to figure out which rape candidate had lost.
That's right. Joe Donnelly beat one in
Donnelly,
Indiana.
that's right.
And Claire McCaskill. But ultimately, it kind of caught up with us. But there's no question that's so the Senate, and the Senate, Bob mentioned the other critical thing, the Panama Canal Treaty. The Senate in the 70s had a lot of very impressive people, Frank Church and Gaylord Nelson and Birch Bayh. The 1980 election was a slaughter of some of the best people ever to serve in the Senate. Literally 8 or 10 Democratic senators. Some guy wrote a book about the last great Senate. I forget it was. It was a very good book.
About the 70s, yeah.
Yeah, and they got the single biggest problem was that America ratified, the Senate ratified the treaty which let Panama have the Panama Canal. And by the way, if that had been defeated and America had still been in charge of the Panama Canal, there would have been a terrible problem of violence and revolt. And on the other side, this prediction by Ronald Reagan that if we gave up the canal and let those Panamanians run the canal in their country, it would be an economic disaster, is of course one of those predictions that was totally untrue.
I'll tell you one Newt story that you will like, because we were talking about the congressman's time in Maine. I had the great privilege of reading part of the biography of George Herbert Walker Bush to George Herbert Walker Bush. And it was in the summer of 2016.
Who wrote that book, John?
It's a really good guy.
Yeah.
Handsome, you know. He has a problem with his boss, but besides that, everything's fine. And it was, they were having it read, they're reading it, and the two chapters I dropped in to read happened to be the ones where Gingrich comes in to the story. And the president at that point wasn't talking very much because of his health. And so he sat there for about 45 minutes like this, never reacting. I get to the introduction of Newt Gingrich, and all of a sudden this voice says, "Oh, Jesus, Newt." Those three words contain multitudes.
Newt was, but again, when George H.W. Bush realized that he had to repudiate his no new taxes thing, he went off and they negotiated with Leon Panetta, who was the leading Democrat, and they came up with a tax bill that frankly was a pretty conservative one, to the point where I and a lot of other liberal Democrats voted against it.
Yep.
And it lost because Gingrich led a revolt against it from the other side and defeated it. And as a result, what happened was the Bush people realized, and this is that the Republicans had become so resistant that the only way it was going to pass it was with more Democrats. So the bill became much better and much more progressive.
Marginal rates went up after Gingrich.
Because of that, and but it was Gingrich turning on Bush at his most vulnerable.
Why don't we have some microphones set up, and so why don't, if you have any questions, feel free to go to the microphone and ask your questions.
Let me caution that we can't see you because of these lights. So if we behave strangely, that's why.
There's a lot to blame on that.
Question back there.
Mr. Frank, thank you for mentioning one of your positions earlier in your career. 2,000 people were in Nashville recently for the Unrig Summit. Their organizers say bypass Congress and force change on cities and states. It's how interracial and same-sex marriages were legalized nationally, and women got the right to vote after 36 states ratified the amendment. So state laws lead to federal victories, they say. Now, Massachusetts and earlier Colorado and Washington legalized recreational marijuana. Will it take 36 states to get Congress to legalize that pursuit of happiness?
No. What it will take, and I wish I didn't have to be partisan about these things, but I wish I could eat more and not gain weight and have as much energy as I used to have. This has now become a very partisan issue. The next time you have a Democratic president, House, and Senate, marijuana will be made legal. What will happen probably in the interim is, and the Senate, the Committee on Financial Services, led by Ed Perlmutter of Colorado, passed a bill that makes it clear that banks in states where marijuana is legal may provide services. It's a terrible problem where you can't bank it, and including not just that, but literally in Northern California where there's a lot of marijuana growing, people lost their money because it literally burned up in the fires because you can't put it anywhere. You got the cash, and you cannot replace burnt money. So the Congress is going to begin to do this, allowing states that want to treat it legally. And the next time the Democrats are in power, it'll be, I think, descheduled, which means it'll be no longer be a drug like that. So no, you won't have to wait for 36 states. 10 states was enough, because there's a mechanism which was relevant for both same-sex marriage and marijuana. In both cases, there's something that some people like to do, and other people don't want them to do it because they disapprove of it morally. But in America, we're still libertarian enough, so you really don't feel comfortable telling people they can't do something they want to do that doesn't affect you because you disapprove of it. So in both cases, marijuana and same-sex marriage, people come up with all these supposed negative social effects, all these things that were going to make it bad for other people. And that keeps a lot of people from saying, well, I don't want to take that chance. And then you get a breakthrough. A state legalizes same-sex marriage, Massachusetts, states legalize marijuana, and it then becomes clear that there are no negative consequences, and it spreads. But I do think you're going to see that with marijuana now. Public opinion is for it. The bill that I talked about got almost half the Republicans on the committee, and it'll happen, I believe, within 5 years, but quicker if the Democrats take over.
Question over here.
Yes, my name is Robert Picard. I'm a adjunct professor of history at Tennessee State University, Nashville State Community College, and anybody else who will hire me, Chancellor. Thought I'd get that in there. Congressman Frank and Mr. Kaiser may also have some opinions on this. I'd like to ask you a historical question about somebody you were associated with many years ago who was an impact speaker here at Vanderbilt 50 years ago and was like you, Jewish and gay and from New York, and that was Lowenstein. At the time he spoke here, he was a major name. He had led the Dump Johnson movement and one-term congressman, and then he lost and ran numerous times for Congress, never made it back. He, I think, ran 7 times in 6 districts. He kept moving like from one part of, from the Bronx over to Long Island and all these different districts. And according to his biography, he could have probably been reelected in the district where he was elected, even though they redistricted him because, but he was out making speeches outside the district 2 weeks before the election and out on international, a lot of international travel and so forth. I'm just wondering how such a brilliant and dedicated man and could be so, and also getting involved in a lot of exotic causes, Sissy Farron, hope for vice president and so forth, how he could have such an unconventional idea of campaigning for Congress.
You're talking about Bill Chaffe's biography from Duke?
Yes, I read that,
Yeah,
Never Stop Running.
It's a wonderful book. You go first.
Lowenstein was an extraordinary character, had a lot of influence on me. He had the idea for the Mississippi Freedom Summit. He was one of the best examples of pragmatist and idealist, although he got elected to Congress in '68, the year he did the Dump Johnson movement. Nelson Rockefeller then helped convene a special session of the Republican-dominated legislature in New York to do a redistricting outside of the regular cycle to defeat him by changing his district. And it's true, he then became obsessed. He ran again in '72 against John Mooney in Brooklyn, a very conservative machine Democrat, and he probably won, but he got counted out. And at that point, he lost his compass, you're right. I mean, he just became so enraged that twice in a row he'd been deprived of being a member of Congress, that he then ran again in '76 and '78 when it didn't make sense in districts where it didn't make sense. He was then murdered in 1980 by a former student volunteer in Mississippi.
Acolyte.
Yeah, literally went nuts. He pulled out his teeth because the aliens who were controlling him, or somebody was controlling him. And I think that the unfairness of being cheated out of a congressional seat twice is what did it. He was an extraordinary man with a great deal of influence on a lot of people, and still had a major. There's a congressman named Andy Jacobs from Indiana, who was a good friend of ours, and at one point he said he tried to persuade Lowenstein that he was so effective he didn't have to be in Congress, and Lowenstein was saying, "I got to be in Congress," and Jacobs said he then mentioned a name to the guy, and Lowenstein said, "Who's that?" And Jacobs said, "He's been in Congress for 20 years, and nobody knows him, but they know you." But I think that the bitterness over being twice cheated out of a congressional seat that he should have won did drive him off his compass a little bit.
Bob, do you want to add anything?
No, I have to make clear that Barney and I both knew Al very well. We met maybe the same time that we met each other at the National Student Congress in Madison, Wisconsin, August 1971. 61, just the other day.
Question over here?
Hi, my name is Whitney Harris. I'm a senior at Vanderbilt, and actually, after I graduate, I'm going to work at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, so thanks for my job. Today, in a hearing called Holding Mega Banks Accountable, the House Financial Services Committee convened to reflect upon what happened 10 years after the financial crisis, and they mentioned the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, and I was wondering what it's like to see legislation that you worked really hard on criticized harshly and altered after the fact.
Well, it actually hasn't been altered very much. In fact, even Trump, when the Republicans took over in 2011 and controlled both houses for, 6 years, and they made no legislative change until the last Congress when they did a cooperative effort from Democrats. I didn't like everything in that bill, but the main thing it did I thought was fine, which was to exempt the smallest banks from rules that we never thought were going to apply to them anyway, but they said they had to spend too much money to show they weren't in violation. But that took away from the antis the one politically powerful group, the small banks in everybody's district. And in fact, not only has it been preserved legislatively, but with the exception of the Consumer Bureau, and it's a big exception, the Trump administration until recently has not seriously impaired its functioning. They did shut down the Consumer Bureau, and the reason they hated the Consumer Bureau most, frankly, is that it's an ideological issue, a theological issue. The Republican view is, the prevailing one today, is that government is the source of all evil, and the private sector is the source of all benefit. The notion that people need to be protected from private sector abuses by government action is holy water to the devil. It is an idea that they hate because it repudiates their central ideology. And the CFPB is a very popular example that exists solely to have the government protect people from the private sector. In other ways they have not seriously diminished it. They made a change in the Volcker Rule, Paul Volcker said was okay to him. There is some fear now that they may be ready to move. And the one thing that Jay Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, has been protecting it. Trump's two new appointees that he's talking about, Stephen Moore and Herman Cain, would be a serious problem, except Cain is almost certain not to be confirmed. So we've held on pretty good, and if we get through the next election, we'll be okay. If Donald Trump were to be reelected, then I would say the bill would probably be seriously diminished. The last point is this: as long as it's not legislatively undermined, and it's people not using the powers, I have some hope, because if an administration that believes that it never comes back, it'll be there. But it has survived better than I was afraid it would up till now.
Okay, last question over here.
Hi, Max Schulman, a Vanderbilt student. Thank you all for being here. So sort of electoral and parliamentary question combined. So the way the U.S. Senate elections are structured with the class staggerings and the fact that we have about 19 plus or minus a couple of states that are reliably blue and 31 plus or minus a couple that are reliably red, it's unlikely then the near-term future, at least in the last like 8 years that I can, or in the past next 8 years that I can think of, there's going to be a 60-vote majority for either party. So what does that mean for like specifically partisan legislation that people are campaigning for in 2020? So just like say Medicare for all, regardless of your thoughts on the idea, Democrats aren't going to get 60 votes. So are you foreseeing any kind of parliamentary change to implement non-tax policy without 60 votes? What do you think about the future of that?
Well, I think you're right about the numbers. It's not as bleak as 31-19. You know, the Democrats can win some Senate seats, and I think even in the South, like Florida and North Carolina, could get her. If Trump keeps insulting Puerto Ricans,
Texas.
we may get Florida more easily than we had thought. But what will happen if the Democrats win the House, Senate, and presidency in 2020, which is plausible, they're a few votes away, you will see a use of the reconciliation procedure, which allows you to do things with 51 votes. That's how we did. They never got, Chris Dodd did get 60 for financial reform. They didn't get 60 for health care, but they did it through reconciliation. So health care can be gotten through reconciliation. Other things will be harder. But the question is, at some point, goes back to the Senate, there are already a couple of Republican senators who are feeling some public pressure. The key will be if enough Republicans become afraid of losing in November, more afraid than of losing in the primary. And it could happen. I mean, there are some things that are somewhat popular. But what you will get, I think, is no change in the rules, but a health care, the Democrats will do something about health care through reconciliation. I'm not sure what else they can do. You can't do minimum wage. And the other one they could do through reconciliation, and I believe they will, is infrastructure. A major publicly funded infrastructure and health care bills can be done with 51 votes.
Okay, Richard, is that you? Yes, sir. You have the last question.
Oh, well, thank you.
It's my student.
My name is Richard Hammer. I'm a senior here at Vanderbilt. Mr. Kaiser, in 2014...
Speak up.
Get him a microphone over there.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Mr. Kaiser, in 2014, you published an opinion piece speaking to a lot of the same themes you did tonight, sort of about the loss of the direction of both parties, and also about sort of a growing sense of anti-intellectualism, especially on the conservative side. Do you see this as being, a temporary trend, and is there a path back to a more intellectual form of lawmaking, or is this the new normal in America?
This is a piece I wrote when I was born in Washington. Excuse me. I worked 50 years at the Washington Post. I retired in 2014 and moved to New York City, which was, for me, a very radical thing to do. And I wrote this piece to try to explain, first to myself, why I'm doing this. and it was a good exercise, therapeutic for me. And I'm pleased that it has lived on somehow. If you're curious, if you look me up on Wikipedia, there's a link to the piece right now. And the sad answer, but honest to your question, is that I despair of the general decline of the intellectual level in our society. I have a brother who taught with Barney at Harvard, an historian who's just published a memoir about the decline of serious political history in America. My brother David points out that it's people like Meacham who carry on a tradition which used to be the business of professors of history, but who now don't do this. So it's all journalists writing serious history of this kind. There's the other kinds, but this not. And the level of ignorance in the society about how many justices there are on the Supreme Court, how the Senate does its business, et cetera, is terrifying to me. You see these surveys, kids have no idea how their government works, how the country works. This is a long-term decline. And part of it is the abolition of civics as a subject to be taught in high school. Disappeared in large parts of the country. No civics is taught, and so on. So I hope that you younger people can turn this around, but just at the moment, I'm pretty pessimistic about it. I'm sorry to say.
Let me say, I will add though, and young people unfortunately seem to be, it's worse rather than getting better, because the internet is a major, it's gotten worse. The internet is a great technological achievement and the greatest instrument for the dissemination of nonsense ever existed.
It's television.
Well, much more, because television was more entertainment. I've told young people who used to work for me would say, they'd say something wholly implausible. How do you know that? I read it on the internet. Well, when I was their age, I read it on the internet meant somebody told me. That's all it means. The internet, and in fact, how can you do anything serious when people's attention span, these things are so boiled down. I got to say, even newspapers, I'm a newspaper reader, I was afraid, I just had an operation, you see the cane. I said a couple years ago, I was afraid that my heart was good and I was going to outlive two things on which I had relied for my whole life, newspapers and my spine. When I read the newspaper on the internet and then I read it, it's got more, the articles are even boiled down. There's more in the article, so I stopped reading it on the internet. So that is a major, it has gotten worse. One other thing I want to say, a personal note, and Bob explained, he's really uprooting himself in an almost literal sense to go to New York, and it was partly because of what he said, but it was also, and people in the audience ought to know this, in facilitation of a very important career move for his wife. And while that shouldn't be of any great notice, and for men of my generation, that is a very significant thing that cannot be taken for granted, and he did that to accommodate his wife's career.
The gentleman who identified himself as an adjunct professor made me want to do what I'm not going to do, which is brag about my wife, who got her PhD in anthropology about 25 minutes before she got her Medicare card and became an adjunct professor at Fordham University, and was so appalled by the treatment that Fordham gave to adjuncts that she literally, with help from Barney, organized a union. And the adjuncts at Fordham are now represented by the SEIU and are doing much better, thank you.
And Hannah recruited me for that, and I was able to be help in particular because Fordham is a Jesuit school, as are many of the best institutions around, and I am a firm member of the Jesuit tradition. My predecessor, I owe my job, the fact that I got elected to Congress, to Pope John Paul II, because he ordered my predecessor, a Jesuit priest named Robert Drinan, not to run again. And so I was conversant with some Jesuit doctrine, which was helpful. But Hannah did, including getting herself pushed against the door, I think, by the security. But yes, they do now have an adjunct union, and I think that's going to spread to other Jesuit schools.
I hope I'm not causing trouble for you.
Never, never. It is a university,
Yes.
and we welcome all free ideas. So I want to say thank you very much for this wonderful evening and for this great visit. It's been enlightening and I still think encouraging for the young people.
You draw a high-level crowd.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much for coming.